Hey guests, welcome back to Room 66. In today's video, we're going to be following this week's top 10 scariest true stories that we had submitted by you guys from Reddit. Sometimes real-life events can be even more truly terrifying when they can actually happen to you, or even your family. So let's begin. The Repo Man. I once was a repo man in the Southern California area, and one time I had to go about an hour away to this man's house, who was surrendering his motorcycle to us. I had talked to this man on the phone, who seemed very nice, and we made plans for me to meet the man at his house, and he would leave his garage door open for me to come inside, and that he would meet me there. I usually always do repos with my buddy Rob, so I called Rob up to ask if he wanted to make some money, because I usually need another person with me to spot me while we lift the bikes up without dropping them. Rob picks up and informs me that he's way too sick to go today, so I had to rearrange to come back to the man's house the next day. So me and Rob go to the man's house the next day, only to see the house wrapped in police tape, but there's no one around. No policemen, no police cars, no one. So I knock on the door, and nothing. We decide to knock on the neighbor's door, and the neighbor answers. We ask, "Hey, do you know the man next door? We're here to repo his bike, and what's up with the police tape?" The neighbor responds, "Oh, the police had his place surrounded last night. I guess he was luring people to his house and chopping their bodies up and disposing them around Universal City." My face dropped. If it wasn't for Rob being sick, I would have met that man face to face, in his house, where he was leading me. I stopped doing repos since, but that story always sticks in the back of my head. Kidnapped in another country. When I was around 10 years old, I went to Cancun with my family. We didn't know it was hurricane season, and there was one heading towards Cancun at the moment. There were no flights out of the city, and only buses or taxis. The taxis were very overpriced due to the fact everyone was trying to get out. Then, while standing near a bus station, a random man approached us asking if we needed a ride out of the city. We were very trusting people and quite desperate, so of course we said yes. Let me add that there were 7 of us. Only me and my dad were guys. The rest were women. So we enter the dude's pickup truck and we notice the doors are locked from the outside, and we can't open them. The guy goes to put gas and takes out a huge wad of money in a rubber band to pay for gas. The taxi driver saw this guy, and right as we were about to drive out of the boulevard, they all in unison blocked the streets with their cars. They had literally stopped all traffic with like 6 taxis. They said we couldn't leave with that man for a reason that they didn't mention. So then they threatened the guy with calling the police, but as soon as he heard the word police, he dropped us off and left. Now when we think back at this guy, we feel like the taxi saved us from being kidnapped by someone who fits the very profile of a kidnapper in Mexico. Although we were left to wander the streets at night in the outskirts of Mexico, it was definitely worth our lives. The Evil Audi. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible, back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out, as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he'd plowed through. The car ended up the right way up, and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head, when it severed his spinal cord. The Ghost of Old Red Tom. Before my dad died, he once told me a story from when he was in Vietnam in the 1960s. He told me about a mission where he and one other American, with 5 CIDG strikers, were tasked to emplace seismic ground sensors along a trail network deep in the jungle. He said they were about 2 days into the mission when he and two of the other strikers split off from the main group to go watch a nearby trail intersection. He said the jungle was pretty quiet that day, just the sounds of birds and bugs and an occasional monkey. He said that they had been watching the trail intersection for about 3 or 4 hours and were deciding on whether to move further down the trail or to turn back and link up with the rest of the patrol. Before leaving the cover of the brush, my dad said he'd check the trail ahead of them one last time and prepared his men to move. Now here's where the story gets interesting, and he told this part with absolute dead seriousness. He said that just as he started to step out into the trail, he sees a light-skinned black Union cavalry soldier in full battle gear lying alongside the trail just shy of the intersection. My dad said the Union soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a short curved club at his hip. As my dad was trying to process what he was seeing, the soldier looked directly at him and smiled. Then the soldier slowly placed a finger up to his lips, as if to tell my dad to be silent, and then motioned him to back off of the trail. My dad said that he signaled for his men to remain hidden, and he recalled that as he slipped back into the jungle on one side of the trail, the Union soldier did the same on his side of the trail. Less than 10 seconds later, he said the lead element of the group of the NVA walked right through the trail intersection some 30 feet away. My dad estimated that the group was comprised of some 70 to 80 soldiers, equipped with automatic rifles, light machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. He has no doubt that his entire team would have been wiped out on the spot. He said as soon as the soldiers had passed, he and his team beat feet out of there as fast and as quietly as they could, and rejoined the rest of the patrol. He reported the enemy soldiers to his team, but decided not to say anything about the soldier he had seen. My dad kept this secret for many years, only telling me just before he passed, and earlier telling his grandmother on her deathbed in the 1970s. He said when he told his grandmother, she smiled and without opening her eyes told him, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom was my great-great-grandfather. He was half black, half Creek, free man who was a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War and later served with the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a Creek war club into battle. Party gone horribly wrong. A female friend in college disappeared from a party at another university in the city town 25-ish miles north of our school. She had arrived with another friend who I believe had driven. At some point she split off to play cornhole or something, and was later inexplicably gone. Phone calls went to voicemail. Police were called, but she was just simply missing. About 10 days later, she was found by a homeless man who witnessed her crawling up to a bus stop in the city, begging for help. She had broken a leg and an arm and was in very bad shape. At the quite large party, she had her drink secretly drugged and was then led off by a group of men into their vehicle. She was taken to an apartment where she was drugged, repeatedly touched, and locked in a small room with a bucket to use as the bathroom. At one point, after being injected with heroin and touched, she somehow managed to convince one of her captors to allow her to use the actual bathroom to clean herself up. This bathroom had a small window to the outside, and with the shower running, she managed to squeeze out and fell from the 3rd story into a large bush. From there, she crawled from the apartment complex to the road and the bus stop, where the homeless man saw her and called the police. Many cars stopped upon seeing her, making her captives unable to recapture her. 3 men were later arrested for the crime, after surveillance cameras allowed police to locate the apartment in which she jumped from. She returned to our university almost 2 years later, graduated, and became a nurse. She was obviously traumatized, never partied again, carried a gun everywhere she could, and somehow moved on with life. It was a terrifying tale none of us ever forgot. She was an 18-year-old freshman when the incident happened. Late night dinner. When I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typically social team, out for beers and pizza after with the guys. Family event type thing. My parents were good friends with two of the other couples. Both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other two couples had left their kids at one of their houses with a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night, but I was being fussy, and my mom nicked the idea, though they would have 100% have normally gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. Two men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter, and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents as hostages as well, and made the dads drive with them to the banks and a grocery store where one of the dad was the managers, and cleared out accounts in a safe. They then came back to the house and slaughtered both families, the babysitter and her boyfriend, kids included. They caught the two guys later on. My dad attended the trials and said it was the first time that he had ever thought of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day too. The unexpected guest. Years ago, when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house, kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning, I noticed the basement door was open and the lights on before I left, and I turned off the lights and I closed the door. When I got home that afternoon, the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I had forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it this morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs, I looked down and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door, and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months I didn't tell my family because I was positive that what I had seen was a ghost, and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident, my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800 and $900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights, trying to figure out if someone could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I have ever had. The not-so-friendly neighbor. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple of derelict cars parked near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go out to the window, there'd be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noise, so he'd go outside to look, but he wouldn't find anything. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property, but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around, they would find nothing, so they told him he needed to stop calling them for this, and perhaps get a security camera or whatever. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening, he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cigarette out and snuck around to the front, and got there just in time to see the doors to his van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, and when they approached the van, the door swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that the people were shooting up in there. 30 seconds too soon. I don't regret many things in my life, but I regret this one deeply. I was leaving work, 2001 I believe, so while cell phones were common, not everyone had them. I worked in a small office building, you know, those kind that rent out spaces to several small businesses. I had stayed late one day, only reason I felt as bad as I do. As I was leaving, I was the only other car in the lot. I noticed the property manager, an elderly lady, very sweet, getting out of her car next to the dumpster holding a bag of trash. I drove past her, turned the corner, and went home. This was on a Friday night. Come to find out, she didn't put her car in park. I get in Monday to the news that she was pinned between the dumpster and her car until found on Sunday. Our dumpster was not visible from any main road. Had I been 30 seconds later in leaving, I would have seen it happen. Being elderly, the low impact still pinned her and broke some bones. Even though she was found alive, she didn't make it at the hospital. I don't know if I had seen it happen, if I would have been able to react fast enough to warn her, jump out, and push the car. It wasn't accelerating, just rolling in neutral. Or if I would have been able to just call 911 and her injuries are treatable not after being outside for 2 days. And I can't imagine her mindset. We were in a commercial area, no real reason for anyone to be immediately within earshot if she called for help, which I'm sure she did many times. A life I never had. About 9 years ago, I was an underground engineer working on large machinery miles underground at a mining site. My specific duties were keeping a large boiler running. We had more than a dozen, each with a few engineers signed to specific ones in shifts. These things were running 24/7, as they provided power to not only the mining shafts, but the large town that was built underground to house all the miners and their families. We're probably talking 20,000 people here. Now these boilers were breaking down constantly, and if more than 4 went down at once, the power was cut to the town to keep the industrial sector powered. If the industrial sector ran out of power, the air pumps would go down, resulting in death. So yeah, I can still remember working on these giant 30-foot tall boiler stacks and the specific parts that would be fashioned routinely to makeshift repairs to keep them up. Nobody had been to the surface in decades due to pestilence and other assorted dangers. This was a full self-contained city. We had politicians, service workers, weavers, cooks, everything. Everybody worked. My wife worked at the school where our 3 children were currently enrolled. In 3 years, Robert would be 16, in which case he would leave school and begin working. The other 2 were quite a bit younger. I can still remember almost every street, house, and building in the city, down to the smallest detail. I have memories of hundreds of people, faces, names, and personalities. I can picture how our small house was decorated and all the bits and bobs we had in it. I can see the children's teddies, blankets, and beds. Anyways, I was mid-30s at the time, so I had built up a life of experiences with these people. Suddenly, I wake up. Now I have that in quotations, because I was already awake. I'm disoriented. There's a whole bunch of bright white lights around me, when all we have is the orange sodium lamps underground. There are faces around me that I recognize, and are asking me all sorts of questions. It turns out I had contracted a serious bacterial infection, was hospitalized with a fever, and I had been out cold for no more than 4 days. My brain had conjured up this whole world, people, buildings, experiences, while I was out cold. It was utterly surreal. I tried to talk to my then girlfriend about it, and she kind of focused more on how serious my condition was, so I never spoke of it again with anybody. Now, I'm sure a lot of people have these types of hallucinations, but this was so crazy real. It wasn't like I was seeing pink dragons in my bathtub. I had 30 years of memories in my head, of a life that I had never lived. A wife, kids, friends, work colleagues. I could remember all of them, but none of them existed. This realization threw me into a deep depression for a while. I'd omitted a whole bunch of detail from the story, due to how even 9 years later, it makes me feel somber. It scares me how my brain could just conjure up something so real that wasn't. Thanks, guests, for your stay here at No Vacancy in room 66. Remember to leave your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe.